Was the resurrection of Jesus an historical event? You may be surprised by my answer to this question today. Some of you may even be upset. Some among you who anticipate being upset may not be. But before I talk about the resurrection of Jesus himself, I want to set the scene. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 to 24, we read the story of how the prophet Elijah took the dead son of the widow at Zarephath and prayed to God to bring him back to life. He even stretched himself out on the boy. He begged and implored God, and sure enough, God brought the boy back to life. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 18 to 37, Elisha performed a similar feat for the son of a Shunammite woman, praying and lying on top of the boy, even seeming to give him mouth to mouth. And sure enough, the boy returned to life. In 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 20 to 21, a man comes back to life after being tossed into Elisha's tomb and touching Elisha's bones. Now, I'm not going into the question of whether these events actually occurred, or if they did occur, what really happened. My only point here is that in the Old Testament, there are 3 stories of people who were dead and who came back to life. That's how those who wrote and read these stories would have understood this. In the New Testament, Jesus raises the daughter of Jairus from the dead. He raises the widow's son at Nain from the dead. He raised Lazarus from the dead. We've seen that prophets can do this kind of thing, apparently. And in the book of Acts, Peter raises Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, from the dead. That's 7 accounts just in the Bible of people returning from the dead. In the histories of Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, we read the story of one Aristeas, a poet and mystic from Proconnesus, who supposedly died but was later seen alive by the people of his hometown. According to the legend, Aristeas died inside a fuller's shop and his body was prepared for burial, but he was later seen walking the streets alive. In Lives of the Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, Empedocles is credited with restoring life to the dead. It is said that he was so skilled in magic and healing arts that he restored a woman who had been dead for 30 days to life. My point here is that at the time of Jesus, it was not unknown for people who had reportedly been dead to, reportedly, return to life by various means. Again, I'm not going into the question of whether these accounts are historical or what actually happened in each case. Such occurrences, though obviously rare, were known to occur. The concept of someone who was dead returning to life wasn't foreign to the Jewish people at the time of Jesus. Now, these were not dying, rising God stories. These were stories of ordinary mortal folk like you and me, dying and then returning to life, presumably ordinary mortal life, and presumably to die again at some later time. It's interesting to compare these stories with the story of Jesus' resurrection. His resurrection is immediately interpreted in theological terms. Immediately. These others, as far as I'm aware, were not. No one developed any theological doctrine around Tabitha. There was nothing special about her, returning to life or not. Again, I'm not asking the question of whether or not Jesus actually rose from the dead. I'm just asking how people understood or interpreted this event, real or not. Paul, for instance, insists that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. This is not, according to this view anyway, the temporary reanimation of a corpse. No one thought this about Dorcas. No one thought she was going to live forever. No one thought it about the widow's son or any other recipient of this miracle of resurrection. Paul regards Jesus as the first fruits of the resurrection, implying that his resurrection is the beginning of a general resurrection for humanity. It's the beginning, the harbinger of the ultimate fate of all believers. It's quite evident that to Paul and the early disciples that Jesus was not simply understood to be a reanimated corpse walking among them. The Gospels have him appearing and disappearing suddenly in and out of locked rooms. He was often not recognized even by his own disciples. Clearly he was not just resurrected but transformed. Strangely, the Gospels, and Paul too, still want to insist that his new body was physical. Jesus eats and drinks and can be touched, and oddly, his body still bears the wounds of the crucifixion. Then, of course, Acts reports that he ascended into heaven in this form. The question is often asked whether Jesus' resurrection was an historical event. If I could go back in time and place video cameras in and around Jesus' tomb, what would they record? Would they record anything? In the other cases of returning to life that I've mentioned, presumably, if we could go back in a time machine, we could, in principle, determine whether or not these events occurred and what actually happened. Such events are regarded by those who wrote and read them as rare and unusual events, but not impossible. They were events that clearly occurred in our normal timeline. But Jesus' resurrection is not regarded in this way, even it seems from the very beginning. And the closest we get to it, of course, is in the writings of St. Paul. I would argue that Jesus' resurrection is not intended to be understood as an historical event at all, the way these other resurrection stories are, however unusual they might be. It is immediately a transcendent, ahistorical event, an eschatological event, in fact, an end-of-the-world event that breaks in on the present in some way. Does that mean that I'm defending the idea that the resurrection really happened? Well, no, actually. I think these other resurrections would be subject to normal historical investigation. Whether or not they occurred is, in principle, subject to historical investigation. Although unusual, they are regarded as having taken place in this space-time continuum in which we live. But Jesus' resurrection is explicitly removed from this space-time continuum. It is explicitly described as an event that does not belong in the normal space-time continuum. Of course, the Gospel writers struggle to explain this, but they present to us a figure that is most definitely not an animated corpse, in a way that Lazarus surely would have been. And Paul explicitly develops his theology of the resurrection as precisely not an historical event as we would normally understand that, but as an eschatological event. For this reason, the resurrection of Jesus cannot be investigated as an historical event. I don't think the Gospel writers or Paul intended it to be understood in this way, the way that they might have intended the raising of Dorcas, Tabitha, from the dead to be understood as an actual historical occurrence. That's not to say that Paul didn't believe that people saw the risen Jesus. I'm sure he did believe that. I think, though, he believes that they saw Jesus in the same way that he himself says that he saw Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15:8, he includes himself among the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Paul emphasizes that Jesus appeared to him just as he had appeared to Peter, James, and the other apostles. He uses the same Greek verb, ophthe, to describe his experience as he does for the other appearances, implying that he sees no fundamental difference in the reality of these encounters. For Paul, this encounter was a real appearance of the risen Jesus, and he considered himself a legitimate witness to the resurrection. Clearly, this is not what we today would regard as evidence of an actual historical event. Paul mentions Jesus' burial. He says he was raised from the dead, and he mentions the many witnesses of the risen Christ. But he nowhere mentions the empty tomb. Very few of those who claim to have seen the risen Lord actually saw the empty tomb. Their faith, their belief, wasn't based on this purely contingent historical fact. It was based on their experience of encountering the risen Lord. You know, I reckon that even if we had cameras set up in and around the tomb and filmed the events of that night and morning, Then, if we showed the footage to Paul and it clearly showed that Jesus' physical body was still there, he would just shrug and regard this as irrelevant. He saw the risen Lord himself, as did many others before him, or so he claims. The fact that Jesus' old body remained in the tomb would be irrelevant and wouldn't change his theology. So, when we ask the question, is Jesus' resurrection an historical event? I'm not sure we're even asking the right question, if by that we simply mean, was the tomb empty? Did Jesus get up and start walking around again? Whatever the disciples experienced after Jesus' death, if we're going to allow that they experienced something and weren't just making it all up, this had little to do with the rather trivial question of whether there was an empty tomb. They were aware of other stories of people returning from the dead. They knew that Lazarus' tomb was empty. But whatever this thing was that they believed they were experiencing with Jesus, that wasn't it.